Hey everyone, welcome to the lesson. For this one, I wanted to do a more in-depth look at what's going on in the main theme of Fly Famous Mockingbird and break it down into a couple different little sections. I thought first we can look at what the chords are that are being implied by the melody and also by what the other guys are playing behind Trey. Some things we can take away from that and maybe apply to other things, whether it be improvising or maybe our own songwriting and whatever else you can use or think of to use it for. Then a couple things with that, and then maybe a few tips and ideas for technique. If you're having a hard time playing through this one and getting it up to speed, there are maybe a couple things to look at really closely to help get over the hump with this one. So let's start with just what the chord changes are in the song and then go from there. So in the first bit, we start on the second fret of the D string, and everything goes from there. Now, just even looking at those first few notes, I hear that as an A major. Now, there's a passing tone with a B that we play on the fourth fret of the G string, but I'm thinking of it just as a passing tone, and so let's just call that an A major. Then we go on from there. Now that note really stands out and is really colorful and really grabs my attention, and it really helps lead our ear into the next chord change. Now that's an A sharp, and what happens right after that is Trey plays an F sharp. So if you think about those two notes and the relationship to each other, what you would end up with is an F sharp major chord. And the reason that is such an ineffective way of leading the ear into the next chord is because it's a B minor, and I'll just go right into that. The reason that's so effective is because F sharp is the fifth of B minor, and it really leads us into the change. So I'm going to come back to that F sharp in a little bit and talk about some things we can do with that and some ideas that around that. For now, let's move on from the B minor. There's a little bit of a chromatic fill in there, which I'm also going to come back to in a little bit. But for now, let's just look at what the next chord would be. Now, there's kind of a lot going on in that little bit of the song, but I hear that generally as an E7 chord. And after listening to what the other guys do, especially what the bass is doing, it sounds like it goes from an E down to an E over D, which is really just another way of playing a dominant chord in E7, or at least that's the way I hear it. So we do this E, and that's the fifth of A, which we go right back to for that little kind of turnaround thing. And then we go back into the same starting point with the A, F sharp, B minor, E7, over D, A. Now this time, when we get to this fifth fret of the E string, we hit the A again, just like we did before, but now what ends up happening is we turn it into a G9 chord, and that leads us into a key change, which will be into the key of C. And so I'm just going to move on from there, but actually, before I do that, that last arpeggio, that's a G7 or a G9. Then we go down to a C major with a couple filler notes. Now, by the time we get to the sixth fret of D of the B string, it's a D minor chord that's being implied there, and I think it's what the other guys are playing. Now we come up here, and then when we hear this part, this is a really cool little two-note thing that we hear probably a lot of times in like bluesy music or in a lot of different styles, but you hear it kind of like a So this is kind of like that. In fact, it is just the same kind of thing. So we play the G. Now, this part, I hear that is an F major. If we just had an F on the bass, it would fill it out. And I think that's what Mike Gordon's playing. Then we go from there. I hear that as a C major, but I guess the way Trey's doing it, doing the chord, it would be a C major over G. And then we move on. And to me, that sounds like a D minor over F. And then we lead ourselves back into C major. And in the first round of it, we end up hitting this E, and the other guys are playing an E major chord, which is the fifth of A again. That leads us back in. So we have these two changes. We had a G7 that led us into the key of C from the key of A, and then we got to the key of C, had an E that led us back into the key of A. So it's really an awesome way to go between keys pretty seamlessly. Now, I want to come back to the F7 chord that we looked at just a second ago with that A sharp that's in there. So we going from the beginning, this part. Now, there's a lot of stuff we can do with this. One way you could hear this would be as more of a diminished chord, which in part it is, and you could hear it that way and use it that way. What I would try to do with this and how I hear it is that it's part of a larger chord structure, which I would hear as an F sharp 7 or even an F sharp 7 flat 9, depending on how much tension you want to bring to the change. For what we're doing in this song and what Trey did, it sounds just like an F7 chord, an F sharp 7 chord, or F sharp chord. I don't even think he does an E in there, so it wouldn't be a seventh. But the thing I wanted to talk about was that what's actually happening there is Trey is tonicizing, and he's leading into the next change. And what I mean by that is that he's kind of tricking the ear, the listener, into thinking we're changing into the key of D. And I need to explain that a little bit because that may seem like a strange thing to say because we're going to a B minor, which is also in the key of A. But what happens is that A sharp, to put this into context, the way that I would get that note or make sense of that note in particular, because it seems like a strange note to have in the key of A because it would be very clashy to have an A and an A sharp. So I really hear that note is coming from the key of D, but with one caveat, and it's that I always include the 6 diminished scale as a default scale, which I've mentioned a bunch of times on this channel, but I've done a video, at least one video on that specifically, a little intro on it. I'll link it in the description if you want to check that out. But basically what happens is you add one extra note. So rather than just the 7-note scale that we usually use, we have 8 notes. The result of that extra note, the consequence is that for every key that you play in, if you include that note, you end up with 2 dominant chords. You end up with one that leads you to your major, your tonic, and then one that leads you to your relative minor. In this case, that A sharp really stands out as an F sharp 7, which is the second dominant chord in the key of D, which leads the ear to its relative minor, which is B minor. But really, it's a bit of trickery because we snap right back into the key of A. So it's just it's a bit of trickery, a temporary key change, sort of. And we actually will change keys in a moment. But this is something you can use for your own improvising, your own songwriting, for a lot of different things. I'm just going to lay out 2 quick ideas for this. I did a diminished lesson where I did a worksheet where it goes through all the keys and lays out 2 dominant chords per key rather than just one, which is the normal case. So in this example, if we were leading ourselves into a B minor chord and we wanted to use F sharp 7 to lead it there, it might sound something like, something like that. That's just like a really simple way to do it. Or if we want to spice it up a little bit and create a little more tension, we can make that really sound quite diminished by thinking of that as more of an F sharp 7 flat 9. So in other words, what I'm going to do, as fancy as that sounds, all I'm going to do is just, instead of playing the F sharp as my first note in that run, and you don't have to start on the root or anything, but this is just to keep it simple, I'm just going to simply start a semitone higher, which is the flat 9, and it's going to go like this. And to my ear, that really, really sets up that chord change pretty well. The other way you can use this is that, remember that you will have two dominant chords, or two options of where you want to lead yourself. So the other way you can do this is to have an A7 flat 9 that leads into the D major, because A is the fifth of D, just like F sharp is the fifth of B. And so if I just do kind of the typical change with A7, and I don't mean that that's typical as a bad thing, or that's just more the common thing is what I mean to say. That's how that would sound. And you could play that line any way you want, but that's the sound of it. Now, instead of that, let's make it an A7 flat 9. It has a little more tension, and in some ways the release that you get has more of a payoff. So those are just a couple things you can do with it. The sky's the limit with it. So I would say play around with that. And it may sound a little complicated or confusing if that's a new concept. What I would encourage you to do, if you're feeling that, is rather than trying to understand it in some kind of analytical way or intellectual way, maybe just ask yourself, do I like the sound of that? And if the answer is yes, then it might be worth just playing around with and then digging deeper as you go, just kind of getting it into your consciousness, into your vocab, and we can understand it more as we get into it. It doesn't have to make total sense the first time you do it. That would be kind of strange if it did make sense. Actually, it'd be more unusual than usual. So now I wanted to move on to another thing that really stands out, which is to get back to that change that makes it go from the key of A to the key of C, which was when Trey does the arpeggio for a G7 chord. It's really a G9 chord. Now here's the thing that he does that is so awesome and that we can really take away from it, is that we have that little turnaround lick that goes, in the end of the first part of the main theme. Now on the first time through, that just feels like it completes the theme. We go and then back into it and so on. Now on the second time through, we hit that note, we hit the same note, but we reharmonize it, or Trey did for us. He reharmonizes the A, and instead of hearing it as the root of our key, we hear it as the ninth of our next chord, which is the G7, so our G9 chord. Now, the reason that is important is because the G9 is, that G is the fifth of C, and so it is kind of a gateway to the next key. It really leads us into there. But the way he does it is it's so fluid and seamless that it kind of tricks you into almost not even noticing there's a key change. I mean, you can tell because it really gets a little brighter and things definitely change, but it's very it's a slick way to do it. So again, here's that little turnaround from the key of A for the first part, and then here we go. Now, not to get too much more into that diminished thing, I'll put a link to the video I did on Diminished a little while back. I'll put that in the description if you want to check that out. But you could do a similar thing here as well. You could make that more of like a G7 flat 9, or it could start out 9. That's a little more tension for sure, but you could do that. The point is that there are possibilities and there's potential for things, and it's up to you to decide if you like the sound of it and if you want to take it and use it. But that change really stood out to me, and this ties into something else I wanted to talk about just really briefly with reharmonizing, is that oftentimes there's a thing that'll happen when I'm teaching a private guitar lesson, And it's that I might ask somebody to play something, maybe a major scale, so like the C major scale, for example, and sometimes something like this will happen. They'll go to play it, and everything starts out fine. And then they get there, and then there's this kind of like this look, like something went wrong. And technically, yes, that isn't a wrong note in the sense that it's not in a C major scale. But this is something I wanted to talk about. It's just like Trey used the A to make us feel like it was, instead of the root of A, it was the ninth of G. That's re-harmonizing. We could do the same thing with a mistake like I just did there. That's something I've heard a lot of times, that particular example. And I just want to show you something you could do with that. Now the trick is you have to know kind of where to go with it next. There is some legwork that has to go into it, but it can be really empowering once you do that, to know that no matter what you do and which way you go with things, you can make it work and you can get back home, sort of. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. So if you do that major scale and you get up here and then you get here, then maybe, if you hear that note, to me, I hear that is the major third of a D. So then you could say, and lead it back to C, which is where we started. And you can use that in different ways. That could be something you write, again, as a songwriter. It could be a strategy as an improviser to get out of a jam. I don't mean like a jam, but if you get yourself into a bind where you mess up, then you can make it work, and you can even turn something that was a mistake into a really special moment. So I just wanted to point that out kind of briefly, that no matter where you are, you can make something work if you know where to go after that. So now moving on from there, there's another thing that really stands out to me that happens multiple times in this main theme, and it's that oftentimes Trey does these little chromatic runs, and really what it sounds like is happening is there'll be a chord tone or two, or even scale tone. And what he does is he goes from one to the other and just connects all the dots. This part over here, toward the beginning of the song, reminds me of that. And then it goes from there. But this, it's just a really beautiful sound. It's a way to have a tiny bit of tension that leads to a little tiny release. It's like a little microcosm of that. There's other examples of that in this theme. We have, when we go to the D minor, he does it, let's see, I'll go from here. Here. And then again here to G. Down to F. And then that last one is especially interesting because he goes above the note he's going to, down, down, under, and then back up. He's enclosing the chord tone he's aiming for. And then back down, same thing there. Down, 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 beneath, up, and then up to it. So if you have, this ties into the reharmonizing idea. If you have a thing where you play something and you didn't quite mean to do that, just try going one more semitone, one more fret in one direction, or go under, or go a couple down and then back up. I would say just try to be really creative with it. And oftentimes you can make it work. And it can even end up being an incredible thing that maybe was unexpected. And you can catch lightning in a bottle that way. All right. Now, moving on from there, I wanted to give a couple tips for technique for this song, because obviously it's very fast and it's a very difficult song. I thought it was. I thought this was the hardest song that I've ever tried to play, probably ever in my life. And it's probably because, in large part, there is a ton of inside picking required to play this song. Now, I just want to take a little time to talk about that, because I can't remember if I talked about it on this channel before. But if you're unfamiliar with inside picking versus outside picking, here's just a really quick intro to this. And just a really simple thing you can do to improve this is most of the time, or I'll put it this way, if I ask somebody to play B string, E string, B string, E string back and forth, I think that most people would probably go above the B string, play that on a down, hop over and go up on the E string. So down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. That would be the way I would do it, that's for sure. That's outside picking. You're on the outside of the strings and you're always staying outside and you're going down, up. Inside picking is just simply the opposite thing. You start with your pick in between the strings. You would start with the B string on an up and then follow that up with a down on the E string. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. If you've never tried to do that, I would even pause the video right now and try that. It's actually pretty difficult. I think it is. And the reason for that is that you have this really narrow, really small margin for error with your pick. You can't go too far in any direction because if you do, there will be a consequence. You will end up with either hitting a string you didn't mean to, or you even get that thing where your pick gets stuck. And that's no fun. That's kind of the worst ever. So one thing not only to think about with inside versus outside picking is that you want to maybe consider what your angle is with your pick. If you're really angling your pick down, inside picking might be a little harder. And probably likewise, if you have too much of an upward angle, it would probably be pretty tricky. So maybe try more of a neutral angle with your pick. And for me, that was helpful in this one, because even just right from the very first little part of the song, this also reminds me, somebody left me a question on the original video I did for Fly Famous Mockingbird a few weeks ago, asking if I start with an up or a down, and I would recommend starting with an up. So right out of the gate, you start with an up followed by a down, which is inside picking, just right away. So maybe even just do that, back and forth. I think another thing that makes that kind of thing difficult is when you have to do inside picking, not only inside picking, but with going from string to string on the same fret. I find that to be really difficult. It is for me. It seems ironic. It seems like being on the same fret should be easier, but it ends up sometimes being harder because you have to kind of do this roll off thing, unless you're just barring. But it depends on the context. So yeah, maybe just play around with that and just bring some awareness to your inside and outside picking. That might be really helpful, because at the end of the day, if you're having an issue with any section of any song, it might be helpful just to slow down and say, okay, there's a mistake happening. That is the effect. Now let's see if we can find what the cause is. It's always cause and effect. So if the effect is that you're a little sloppy with your picking there, it's probably because there's something to look at with the angle, or even just how far your motion is, how large the motion is with your wrist, things like that, just to bring awareness to it. And if you can think of it in that way every single time, just about, you can find what the remedy is for it and you can fix the problem. And it's really an amazing thing, because we can analyze people like Trey or some of these amazing guitar players and really benefit from their technique. I know I have from Trey's playing, and many other guitar players, not only the famous ones, but just people in my life that I've been exposed to. We can really pick things up, and he definitely has laid out some awesome technique for us to check out. So the other thing that I would say is that if there is a part that is constantly giving you a hard time, rather than just going through and playing the whole thing just a bunch of times, like going from the start to the finish, just back and forth and hoping it gets better, I would say look right for the part that gives you a hard time and really attack that and really try to turn it into, instead of an Achilles heel, into a strength, or at least to make it less of a weakness. And I'm just going to share one part of this song that I had a really hard time with, and had to do this with, and that's the part up here with the G. That part in particular. So I found that that was really, really, really hard for me. I mean, it's so fast, but I'm having more and more these days issues with my pinky finger. So not only does the pinky finger have to move really fast, but also it has to go higher than its original position, slide down, then you go down beneath it, and then back up. So for me, that was a part I knew I needed a lot of practice with. And so I would just sit there and just take it in these little tiny pieces and do a lot of repetition. So that, I think, is a good strategy to get over the humps that you have in the song, is to not avoid the harder parts. And I'm not saying that anybody's avoiding anything, but it might be tempting to, when you have a part that's really, really tricky, just to kind of bail on it or maybe go to another song. But I would say maybe try to really play that part the most. That's the irony. Go to the part that isn't working and see if you can find that cause and effect relationship and do that part as much as possible. And hopefully at a slow tempo, that you'll really get the most out of it that way. Then just lastly, tying into that lick that I was just doing there, if anybody else has issues with, especially with lines, melodies, licks, whatever it is that involve stuff with your third and fourth finger, I know for me that's always the hardest thing. I did a video on dexterity for those two fingers, almost like a physical therapy kind of thing for those two fingers. So I'm going to link that video. I'll link the diminished lesson and the sixth diminished lesson that I did, in case you want to dig a little deeper into any of those topics. Of course, if you have any questions about anything in what I just covered, please leave them and I'll try to answer them the best that I can. We only covered the first sort of main theme of this song. So if there are other things later in the song that you're having a hard time with or just have a question about, please give me the question and I will try my best to answer it. Other than that, thank you so much for checking out the video. I hope it helped, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.